Part 1. Ideology of Anarchism. Anarchism is a definite intellectual current of social thought, whose adherents advocate the abolition of economic monopolies and of all political and social coercive institutions in society. In place of the capitalist economic order, anarchists would have a free association of all productive forces based upon cooperative labour, which would have for its sole purpose the satisfying of the necessary requirements of every member of society. In place of the present national states with their lifeless machinery of political and bureaucratic institutions, anarchists desire a federation of free communities which shall be bound to one another by their common economic and social interests and arrange their affairs by mutual agreement and free contract. Anyone who studies profoundly the economic and political developments of the present social system will recognise that these objectives do not spring from the utopian ideas of a few imaginative innovators, but that they are the logical outcome of a thorough examination of existing social maladjustments, which with every new phase of the present social conditions manifest themselves more plainly and more unwholesomely. Modern monopoly capitalism and the totalitarian state are merely the last stages in a development which could culminate in no other end. The portentous development of our present economic system, leading to a mighty accumulation of social wealth in the hands of privileged minorities and to a constant repression of the great masses of the people, prepared the way for the present political and social reaction and befriended it in every way. It sacrificed the general interests of human society to the private interests of individuals, and thus systematically undermined a true relationship between men. People forgot that industry is not an end in itself, but should be only a means to ensure to man his material subsistence and to make accessible to him the blessings of a higher intellectual culture. Where industry is everything, where labour loses its ethical importance and man is nothing, there begins the realm of ruthless economic despotism, whose workings are no less disastrous than those of any political despotism. The two mutually augment one another. They are fed from the same source. A modern social system has internally split the social organism of every country into hostile classes, and externally it has broken up the common cultural circle into hostile nations. Both classes and nations confront one another with open antagonism, and by their ceaseless warfare keep the communal social life in continual convulsions. 2 world wars within half a century, and their terrible after effects, and the constant danger of new wars, which today dominates all peoples, are the only logical consequences of this unendurable condition, which can only lead to further universal catastrophes. The mere fact that most states are obliged today to spend the better part of their annual income for so-called national defence and the liquidation of old war debts is proof of the untellability of the present status. It should make clear to everybody that the alleged protection which the state affords the individual is certainly pushed too dearly. The ever-growing power of a soulless political bureaucracy, which supervises and safeguards the life of man from the cradle to the grave, is putting ever greater obstacles in the way of cooperation among human beings. A system which in every act of its life sacrifices the welfare of large sections of the people, of whole nations, to the selfish lust for power and the economic interests of small minorities, must necessarily dissolve the social ties and lead to a constant war of each against all. This system has merely been the pacemaker for the great intellectual and social reaction which finds its expression today in modern fascism and the idea of the totalitarian state, far surpassing the obsession for power of the absolute monarchy of past centuries, and seeking to bring every sphere of human activity under the control of the state. Begin quote, "All for the state, all through the state, nothing without the state," end quote, became the leitmotif of a new political theology which has its various systems of ecclesiastical theology. God is everything and man is nothing, so for this modern political creed the state is everything and the citizen is nothing. And just as the words, "the will of God," were used to justify the will of privileged castes, so today there hides behind the will of the state only the selfish interests of those who feel called upon to interpret this will in their own sense and to force it upon the people. In modern anarchism, we have the confluence of the two great currents which before and since the French Revolution have found such characteristic expression in the intellectual life of Europe: socialism and liberalism. Modern socialism developed when profound observers of social life came to see more and more dearly that political constitutions and changes in the form of government could never get to the root of the great problem that we call the social question. Its supporters recognised that an equalising of social and economic conditions for the benefit of all, despite the loveliest of theoretical assumptions, is not possible as long as people are separated into classes on the basis of their owning or not owning of property. Classes whose mere existence excludes in advance any thought of a genuine community. And so there developed the conviction that only by the elimination of economic monopolies and by common ownership of the means of production does a condition of social justice become feasible, a condition in which society shall become a real community and human labour shall no longer serve the ends of exploitation but assure the well-being of all. But as soon as socialism began to assemble its forces and become a movement, there at once came to light certain differences of opinion due to the influence of the social environment in different countries. It is a fact that every political concept, from theocracy to Caesarism and dictatorship, have affected certain factions of the socialist movement. Meanwhile, two other great currents in political thought had a decisive significance on the development of socialist ideas. Liberalism, which had powerfully stimulated advanced minds in the Anglo-Saxon countries, Holland and Spain in particular, and democracy in the sense to which Rousseau gave expression in Social Contract, and which found its most influential representatives in the leader of French Jacobinism. While liberalism in its social theories started off from the individual and wished to limit the state's activities to a minimum, democracy took its stand on the abstract collective concept, Rousseau's general will, which it sought to fix in the national state. Liberalism and democracy were preeminently political concepts, and since most of the original adherents of both did scarcely consider the economic conditions of society, the further development of these conditions could not be practically reconciled with the original principles of democracy and still less with those of liberalism. Democracy with its motto of equality of all citizens before the law, and liberalism with its right of man over his own person, both were wrecked on the realities of capitalist economy. As long as millions of human beings in every country have to sell their labour to a small minority of owners, and sink into the most wretched misery if they can find no buyers, the so-called equality before the law remains merely a pious fraud, since the laws are made by those who find themselves in possession of the social wealth. But in the same way there can be no talk of a right over one's own person, for that right ends when one is compelled to submit to the economic dictation of another if one does not want to starve. In common with liberalism, anarchism represents the idea that the happiness and prosperity of the individual must be the standard in all social matters, and, in common with the great representatives of liberal thought, it is also the idea of limiting the functions of government to a minimum. Its adherents have followed this thought to its ultimate consequences and wish to eliminate every institution of political power from the life of society. When Jefferson clothes the basic concept of liberalism in the words that the government is best which governs least, then anarchists say with Thoreau that government is best which governs not at all. In common with the founders of socialism, anarchists demand the abolition of economic monopoly in every form and shape, and uphold common ownership of the soil and all other means of production, the use of which must be available to all without distinction, for personal and social freedom is conceivable only on the basis of equal economic conditions for everybody. Within the socialist movement itself, the anarchists represent the viewpoint that the struggle against capitalism must be at the same time a struggle against all coercive institutions of political power, for in history economic exploitation has always gone hand in hand with political and social oppression. The exploitation of man by man and the domination of man over man are inseparable, and each is the condition of the other. As long as a possessing and a non-possessing group of human beings face one another in enmity within society, the state will be indispensable to the possessing minority for the protection of its privileges. When this condition of social injustice vanishes to give place to a higher order of things, which shall recognise no special rights and shall have as its basic assumption the community of social interests, government over men must yield the field to the administration of economic and social affairs, or, to speak with St. Simon, begin quote, "The time will come when the art of governing men will disappear. A new art will take its place, the art of administering things," end quote. In this respect, anarchism has to be regarded as a kind of voluntary socialism. This disposes also of the theory maintained by Marx and his followers that the state, in the form of a proletarian dictatorship, is a necessary transitional stage to a classless society, in which the state, after the elimination of all class conflicts and then classes themselves, will dissolve itself and vanish from the canvas. For this concept, which completely mistakes the real nature of the state and the significance in history of the factor of political power, is only the logical outcome of so-called economic materialism, which sees in all the phenomena of history merely the inevitable effects of the methods of production of the time. Under the influence of this theory, people came to regard the different forms of the state and all of the social institutions as a, begin quote, juridical and political superstructure in the economic edifice, end quote, of society, and thought that they had found in it the key to every historic process. In reality, every section of history affords us thousands of examples of the way in which the economic development of countries was set back for centuries by the state and its power policy. Before the rise of the ecclesiastical monarchy, Spain, industrially, was the most advanced country in Europe and held the first place in economic production in almost every field. But a century after the triumph of the Christian monarchy, most of its industry had disappeared. What was left of them survived only in the most wretched condition. In most industries, they had reverted to the most primitive methods of production. Agriculture collapsed, canals and waterways fell into ruin, and vast stretches of the country were transformed into deserts. Princely absolutism in Europe, with its silly economic ordinances and industrial legislation, which severely punished any deviation from the prescribed methods of production and permitted no new inventions, blocked industrial progress in European countries for centuries and prevented its natural development. And even now, after the horrible experience of 2 world wars, the power policy of the larger national states proves to be the greatest obstacle to the reconstruction of European economy. In Russia, however, where the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat has ripened into reality, the aspirations of a particular party for political power have prevented any truly socialistic reorganisation of economic life and have forced the country into the slavery of a grinding state capitalism. The proletarian dictatorship, which naive souls believe is an inevitable transition stage to real socialism, has today grown into a frightful despotism and a new imperialism, which lags behind the tyranny of fascist states in nothing. The assertion that the state must continue to exist until society is no longer divided into hostile classes almost sounds, in the light of all historical experiences, like a bad joke. Every type of political power presupposes some particular form of human slavery, for the maintenance of which it is called into being. Just as outwardly, that is, in relation to other states, the state has to create certain artificial antagonisms in order to justify its existence, so also internally the cleavage of society into castes, ranks and classes is an essential condition of its continuance. The development of the Bolshevik bureaucracy in Russia under the alleged dictatorship of the proletariat, which has never been anything but the dictatorship of a small clique over the proletariat and the whole Russian people, is merely a new instance of an old historical experience which has repeated itself countless times. This new ruling class, which today is rapidly growing into a new aristocracy, is set apart from the great masses of the Russian peasants and workers, just as clearly as other privileged castes and classes in other countries from the mass of the people. And this situation becomes still more unbearable when a despotic state denies to the lower classes the right to complain of existing conditions, so that any protest is made at the risk of their lives. But even a far greater degree of economic equality than that which exists in Russia would be no guarantee against political and social oppression. Economic equality alone is not social liberation. It is precisely this which all the schools of authoritarian socialism have never understood. In the prison, in the cloister, or in the barracks, one finds a fairly high degree of economic equality, as all the inmates are provided with the same dwelling, the same food, the same uniform, and the same tasks. The ancient Inca system in Peru and the Jesuit state in Paraguay had brought equal economic provision for every inhabitant to a fixed system. But in spite of this, the vilest despotism prevailed there, and the human being was merely the automaton of a higher will on whose decisions he had not the slightest influence. It is not without reason that Proudhon saw in a socialism without freedom the worst form of slavery. The urge for social justice can only develop properly and be effective when it grows out of man's sense of freedom and responsibility and is based upon it. In other words, socialism will be free or will not be at all. In its recognition of this fact lies the genuine profound justification of anarchism. Institutions serve the same purpose in the life of society as physical organs do in plants and animals. They are the organs of the social body. Organs do not develop arbitrarily, but owe their origin to definite necessities of the physical and social environment. Changed conditions of life produce changed organs, but an organ always performs the function it was evolved to perform, or a related one, and it gradually disappears or becomes rudimentary as soon as its function is no longer necessary to the organism. The same is true of social institutions. They too do not arise arbitrarily, but are called into being by special social needs to serve definite purposes. In this way, the modern state was evolved, after economic privileges and class divisions associated with them had begun to make themselves more and more conspicuous in the framework of the old social order. The newly arisen possessing classes had need of a political instrument of power to maintain their economic and social privileges over the masses of their own people, and to impose them from without on other groups of human beings. Thus arose the appropriate social conditions for the evolution of the modern state as the organ of political power for the forcible subjugation and oppression of the non-possessing classes. This task is the essential reason for its existence. Its external forms have altered in the course of its historical development, but its functions have always remained the same. They have even constantly broadened in just the measure in which its supporters have succeeded in making further fields of social activities subservient to their ends. And just as the functions of a physical organ cannot be arbitrarily altered so that, for example, one cannot, at will, hear with one's eyes or see with one's ears, so also one cannot, at pleasure, transform an organ of social oppression into an instrument for the liberation of the oppressed. Anarchism is no patent solution for all human problems, no utopia of a perfect social order, as it has often been called, since, on principle, it rejects all absolute schemes and concepts. It does not believe in any absolute truth or in any definite final goals for human development, but in unlimited perfectibility of social patterns and human living conditions, which are always straining after higher forms of expression, and to which, for this reason, one cannot assign any definite terminus nor set any fixed goal. The greatest evil of any form of power is just that it always tries to force the rich diversity of social life into definite forms and adjust it to particular norms. The stronger its supporters feel themselves, the more complete they succeed in bringing every field of social life into their service. The more crippling is their influence on the operation of all creative cultural forces. The more unwholesomely does it affect the intellectual and social development of power, and a dire omen for our times, for it shows with frightful clarity to what a monstrosity Hobbes Leviathan can be developed. It is the perfect triumph of the political machine over mind and body, the rationalization of human thought, feeling, and behaviour according to the established rules of the officials and, consequently, the end of all true intellectual culture. Anarchism recognises only the relative significance of ideas, institutions, and social conditions. It is, therefore, not a fixed, self-enclosed social system, but rather a definite trend in the historical development of mankind, which, in contrast with the intellectual guardianship of all clerical and governmental institutions, strives for the free and unhindered unfolding of all the individual and social forces in life. Even freedom is only a relative, not an absolute concept, since it tends constantly to broaden its scope and to affect wider circles in manifold ways. For the anarchist, freedom is not an abstract philosophical concept, but the vital concrete possibility for every human being to bring to full development all capacities and talents with which nature has endowed him and turn them into social account. The less this natural development of man is interfered with by ecclesiastical or political guardianship, the more efficient and harmonious will human personality become, the more will it become the measure of the intellectual culture of society in which it has grown. This is the reason why all great cultural periods in history have been periods of political weakness, for political systems are always set upon the mechanizing and not the organic development of social forces. State and culture are irreconcilable opposites. Nietzsche, who was not an anarchist, recognizes very clearly when he wrote, begin quote, "No one can finally spend more than he has. That holds good for individuals, it holds good for peoples. If one spends oneself for power, for higher politics, for husbandry, for commerce, parliamentarism, military interests, if one gives away that amount of reason, earnestness, will, self-mastery which constitutes one's real self for one thing, he will not have it for the other. Culture and the state, let no one be deceived about this, are antagonists. The culture state is merely a modern idea. The one lives on the other, the one prospers at the expense of the other. All great periods of culture are periods of political decline. Whatever is great in a cultured sense is non-political, is even anti-political." End quote. Where the influence of political power on the creative forces in society is reduced to a minimum, there culture thrives the best, for political rulership always strives for uniformity, and tends to subject every aspect of social life to its guardianship, and, in this, it finds itself in unescapable contradiction to the creative aspirations of a cultural development, which is always on the quest for new forms and fields of social activity, and for which freedom of expression, the many-sidedness and the continual changing of things, are just as vitally necessary as rigid forms, dead rules, and the forcible suppression of ideas are for the conservation of political power. Every successful piece of work stirs the desire for greater protection and deeper inspiration. Each new form becomes the herald of new possibilities of development. But power always tries to keep things as they are, safely anchored to stereotypes. That has been the reason for all revolutions in history. Power operates only destructively, bent always on forcing every manifestation of social life into the straitjacket of its rules. Its intellectual expression is dead dogma, its physical form, brute force. And this unintelligence of its objectives sets its stamp on its representatives also, and renders them often stupid and brutal, even when they were originally endowed with the best talents. One who is constantly striving to force everything to a mechanical order, at last becomes a machine himself and loses all human feelings. It was from this understanding that modern anarchism was born and draws its moral force. Only freedom can inspire men to great things and bring about intellectual and social transformations. The art of ruling men has never been the art of educating and inspiring them to a new shaping of their lives. Dreary compulsion has at its command only the lifeless drill, which smothers any vital initiative at its birth and brings forth only subjects, not free men. Freedom is the very essence of life, the impelling force in all intellectual and social development, the creator of every new outlook for the future of mankind. The liberation of man from economic exploitation and from the intellectual, social and political oppression, which finds its highest expression in the philosophy of anarchism, is the first prerequisite for the evolution of a higher social culture and a new humanity.